Walking in the park.
Oh, walking in the park.
So I switch it on the side.
Unhealthy, these things.
Yeah, never walk across a green flat lawn.
Always unhealthy, these things.
So, and now the micro.
Oh, this is very fancy. This is the microphone.
Yes,
Wow.
in front, here.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I think we just start. So first of all, I want to excuse and ask for your understanding to those of you who are not familiar with the German language. We try to speak as much as possible the local languages, as we are a global organization with signatories in several countries around the world and with many languages. And it is the wish of our signatories to interact and speak as much as possible in their local language. That is why I will now switch to German for my welcome note. The rest of the conference will of course be in English language, so that everybody can understand it. So please allow me to start in German. Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, ich begrüße Sie ganz herzlich heute hier in Zürich zu unserer Veranstaltung, die wir gemeinsam mit Swiss Sustainable Finance durchführen. Mein Name ist Melanie Klebeck. Ich bin die Netzwerkmanagerin bei PRI, zuständig für die Schweiz und Liechtenstein. Ich freue mich sehr, dass wir in so großer Anzahl hier zusammenkommen. Leider konnten wir nicht alle Registrierungswünsche berücksichtigen. Aus diesem Grund haben wir uns entschieden, die Veranstaltung live zu übertragen und auch im Nachgang auf den Websites von SSF und PRI zur Verfügung zu stellen. Ein großes Dankeschön von unserer Seite geht natürlich an die Zürcher Kantonalbank. Vielen Dank, Marit Kutow und Team, für die Ausrichtung dieser Veranstaltung. Wie Sie ja alle wissen, ist PRI Principles for Responsible Investment eine Investoreninitiative, die 2006 in Partnerschaft mit dem mit der Finanzinitiative des UN-Umweltprogrammes und dem UN Global Compact gegründet wurde und wird unterstützt von den Vereinten Nationen. Ihr Ziel ist es, die Investitionsauswirkungen von Umwelt-, Sozial- und Unternehmensführungsthemen zu verstehen und die Unterzeichner bei der Einbeziehung dieser Themen in die Investitions- und Eigentumsentscheidungen zu unterstützen. Gestartet ist PRI mit einer ganz kleinen Gruppe von Asset-Ownern und wir sind innerhalb kurzer Zeit zu der weltweit größten Nachhaltigkeitsinitiative angewachsen, mit mittlerweile mehr als 2600 Unterzeichnern und einem verwalteten Vermögen von über 90 Billionen US-Dollar. Allein im letzten Jahr sind 480 neue Unterzeichner hinzugekommen, davon allein 80 Asset Owner. Insgesamt hat PRI mehr als 470 Asset Owner und wir ermutigen jeden Einzelnen, egal in welcher Größe, PRI beizutreten, als Asset Owner geführte Initiative. Denn wir sind der Meinung, es hilft ja auch den Vermögensverwaltern, wenn sich die Asset Owner an der Spitze der Investitionskette klar dazu positionieren, verantwortlich zu investieren und Umwelt-, soziale und Unternehmensführungsthemen in ihre Investitionen zu integrieren. Europaweit haben wir über 800 Unterzeichner und wir sehen nicht zuletzt durch den EU-Aktionsplan und der EU-Taxonomy eine hohe Dynamik in den Märkten. So auch in der Schweiz, die zwar nicht unmittelbar von den Ergebnissen des EU-Aktionsplanes betroffen ist, wohl aber mittelbar. Auch hier können wir zunehmend Interesse und Umsetzungen im Bereich ESG und verantwortliches Investieren feststellen. Mittlerweile haben wir in der Schweiz mit Stand heute 106 Unterzeichner, davon 14 Asset Owner, 70 Investment Manager und 22 Service Provider. Allein die Zürcher Region hat über 50 Unterzeichner, in der Genfer Region sind es bislang knapp 30. Nach oben hin ist also noch jede Menge Platz, aber ich denke, wir sind einen guten Weg gegangen bisher und werden ihn auch weitergehen. Dieses belegen auch zum Beispiel die Zahlen des diesjährigen PRI in Person, unserer Jahreskonferenz, die im September in Frankreich in Paris stattgefunden hat. Hier waren fast 1800 Delegierte aus über 830 Organisationen und 54 Länder versammelt. Es war die weltweit größte Konferenz für verantwortliches Investieren. Während eben dieser Konferenz haben wir auch unsere Leadership-Gruppe vorgestellt, die PRI in diesem Jahr zum ersten Mal ernannt hat. Die PRI Leaders Group 2019 präsentiert PRI Asset Owner Unterzeichner, die sowohl ein breites Spektrum an verantwortungsbewusster Investmentkompetenz aufweisen, als auch sich speziell in dem diesjährigen Thema auszeichnen: die Auswahl, Ernennung und Überwachung externer Manager, Selection, Appointment and Monitoring. Hier haben sich insgesamt 47 Asset Owner hervorgetan. Ganz besonders freue ich mich, dass zu dieser Leadership-Gruppe auch Schweizer Unternehmen gehören, und zwar Swiss Re und Zurich Insurance Group. Herzlichen Glückwunsch. PRI bietet eine komplette Bandbreite an Möglichkeiten, Ressourcen, Publikationen, Webinare und natürlich den persönlichen Support, um das Thema verantwortliches Investieren im Unternehmen, aber auch in den Investitionen voranzutreiben. Sollen Sie hier weitere Fragen haben rund um PRI, stehen meine Kollegen und ich Ihnen gerne später nach der Veranstaltung bei unserem Mittagessen zur Verfügung. Ich freue mich auf eine gute Veranstaltung und möchte Ihnen jetzt noch die Agenda vorstellen. We will now hear the welcome note of Sabine Döbeli, CEO at Swiss Sustainable Finance, followed by a presentation of my colleague Edward Baker, Senior Policy Advisor, Climate and Energy Transition at PRI, about TCFD and how investors can position themselves for a low-carbon economy. Then my colleague Sheila Whitley, Director of ESG at PRI, will talk about the investor role in delivering the SDGs. And last but not least, we will have a panel of experts discussing how practitioners incorporate frameworks effectively and efficiently and challenges they face. The panel will be moderated by Sabine Döbeli, and together with her on the panel, we will have Claudia Bali from Swiss Re, René Nicolodi from ZKB, and Tycho Snijers from LGT Capital, who is also a member of the PRI board. Thank you very much, and over to you, Sabine.
Thank you, Melanie, for these introductory words. And I would like to welcome you all on behalf of Swiss Sustainable Finance, co-organizer of today's conference. I must say we were overwhelmed with the applications for this event. Within 24 hours, we were fully booked. We then overbooked and now have a full room here. I'm very happy to see so many faces interested in the topics with which we seem to have hit the nerve. We will discuss the role of the TCFD and the SDGs for investors. Well, both climate change and the SDGs are becoming ever more important for the financial community. In our market study that we published in June this year, roughly 50% of the asset managers said that they already had products in place with a link to the SDGs. The reason they offered these products were manifold, but the two major reasons were that they saw the SDGs as a useful framework to direct investments towards solutions, or on the other hand, that they saw growing client demand with regards to the SDGs. We also asked them if they had any products with link to climate change. It's even 2/3 of the asset managers that have some sort of products with such a link. Different types, I have to say. Some of them are thematic products. It was the first naming. They then have products where they measure the carbon footprint and try to reduce it, or they even lead engagement processes related to climate change. Yet, we all know that data availability is still an issue, especially in the field of climate change, but maybe even more so on the side of the SDGs. The TCFD recommendations are a tool that was developed by financial market players jointly with regulators, but clearly on a voluntary basis. We already see that it's becoming more mandatory now that some organizations are taking it up as a reporting requirement, namely the PRI as well, but also other organizations. It will hopefully help to increase the quality of climate-related information. It will definitely be interesting to hear from Edward Baker how he sees the finance world progressing with regards to integrating climate information into investment decisions, but also with regards to investor action. I think we shouldn't forget about that. Regarding the SDGs, I think the world is still a bit different. We don't have this uniform framework that tells investors how to integrate them. They have so far to rely on their own judgment on how to measure the contribution to the SDGs. What I find worth remarking in this context is certainly the Impact Management Project, a project with about 3,000 stakeholders that provided input, a project that defines how you can measure impact with regards to a lot of sustainability topics, many of them referring to the SDGs. But it's by far not as structured as the TCFD as a recommendation. Anyway, in the case of climate change, it is no longer just NGOs that raise the voice about the responsibility of the financial community in this place. More recently, it's been other players like central banks and regulators that have started to drill in. EIOPA, for example, the pension fund and insurance regulator of the European Union, has integrated climate risks in their stress test for pension funds for the first time this year. And they plan to expand this to the insurance industry next year. Another remark on the SDGs. There I found it remarkable that Dutch pension funds declared it as part of their fiduciary duty to have a positive impact. So not just the fiduciary duty to take risks into account, but really go a step further and say it's their duty to have a positive impact on the society in the long run. That can also be related to the SDGs, and they clearly go beyond climate risk with this. But I stop here, and without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Edward Baker to learn more about the PRI activities in how they support investors in adopting TCFD. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Sabine, and thank you for your great support in putting on this event. It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to be back in Zurich and speak with you about the energy transition. As was introduced, my name is Edward Baker. I work with the PRI as their senior specialist on climate change and energy transition. And really, over the next 15 minutes or so, I just want to talk to you about the why, what, and how of managing climate-related risks and opportunities. The why, just pausing to reflect, why is this topic important for investors, beyond being a good person? What are the reasons why investors should care about climate change? The what being sort of 12 months on since we were last back in Zurich. What are the indicators of change in this space in terms of what your peers are doing internationally, and also in terms of what the regulators, as we're just hearing from Sabine, are doing? And then the how, particularly on sort of how to get started, and taking a look at some of the tools that are available. There has been a rapid growth in sort of tools, both commercially available and free-to-use tools. So what can these do, and how can they help you? And then also, I think a theme perhaps for our conversation this morning is really, how do all these various different initiatives, TCFD, SDGs, also touch on very briefly the EU taxonomy, how do they all fit together? Is there not a risk of sort of duplicating and overlapping requirements for investors? So, let me just take you through some slides. I think, first of all, just to perhaps remind some of you who it represents. So the PRI is an investor network. We have now over 2,600 signatories. Over the last couple of years, we've been growing at a very rapid rate. So last year was net increase of around 350 signatories. But not only growing, we also actually delisted 100 signatories. And so as the PRI increases in size, I think there is an important question about what it means a signatory to the principle of responsible investment these days. And I mention all of this because it's an indication of who else amongst the institutional investor community might be thinking about issues like TCFD and the SDGs. About the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures, we might think that, first of all, it is a reporting framework. And yes, that's true, but actually disclosures are not the end goal. There are some more fundamental questions to be assessed before it comes to disclose. So in particular, how robust organization to climate-related risks? Could this be a source of mission failure? In the same sense, you have longevity risk, you also have funding risk. Is this another factor that's out there that needs to be considered at the most senior levels? And then TCFD, what it's trying to do is address two fundamental questions. The first is to test the resilience of the investment strategy to a range of possible futures that we may face as a result of climate change. And secondly, to structure corporate and investor engagement, provide a benchmark for ESG, if you like. And so in that disclosure itself is really only the final 10% of the work, or the tip of the iceberg, if you like. So these are the TCFD recommendations. It's a bit of an eyesight challenge for those at the back of the room, but essentially these are 11 questions which are designed to help investors answer the question, which companies could transform themselves from being incumbent industry today to innovators in a low-carbon or zero-carbon world in the future? And of those 11 questions, there's 2 that really matter. The first is the governance question, describing the board's oversight of these issues. Because if the board isn't focused on this, then you can be pretty sure that it's unlikely that the company will be able to completely redirect its business operations. And the second is this forward-looking analysis. And it's worth remembering that it's not just to do scenario analysis, but it's to test the results of the business strategy against a range of possible futures. Sometimes it becomes more of a sort of a process step. And the final thing, of course, is that TCFD is perhaps it breaks with the convention of previous disclosure frameworks in that investors are not only users of this information that's generated from companies, but they're also preparers. So with that in mind, how could you start implementing these recommendations? Now, there's no one answer to this question, but what we have here is perhaps a 4-step approach that we see some investors taking and could be implemented. So these 4 steps are getting started, building institutional muscle internally, in-depth analysis of potential trouble spots and opportunities, and identifying sort of a strategic response and then implementing that. So on the getting started point, this really comes back to your investment beliefs, how you view the future and how climate change relates to that. Becoming familiar with these kind of core issues, the recommendations themselves, and also the work of what your peers have been doing. Shopping the issue internally. The next step is perhaps the most difficult step of all, and that is to take climate change to the board. And there's a big question about who does that. But once it's there and there's a conversation takes place, then there's a need to assign executive and managerial level responsibility and establish internal processes. And the point here is that as much as tools and sophisticated methodologies are important, unless you have people that can understand them, TCFD can easily become sort of a tick box exercise, and you can miss the fundamental question that it's really was set up to help investors with. So once you've kind of gone through that process, then it's a case of perhaps doing the analysis again, but in a greater depth, doing top-down macroeconomic analysis, or even bottom-up, as you traditionally might do through corporate engagement. And you're presenting the problem internally, and then you're setting targets and engagement strategies and making disclosures. So that's sort of a quick trot through the types of process you go through with TCFD. And as I say, it's the actual disclosures themselves that only a small percentage of the work, as I'm sure many of you in the room would attest to. So let's just quickly take a look then at potential views of the future. This slide here shows 3 potential scenarios of how climate change could play out. And so what you have is you have emissions on the y-axis, time along the bottom axis, and what this shows is orderly transition is a dotted blue line, so that signifies a steady rate of emissions reduction at a global level, starting immediately. Abrupt transition, whereby we kind of continue on as we are until such a point where there is a rapid change in policy and a reduction in emissions. And then finally, known transition, a failure to transition. And I guess the point here is that for investors, there will certainly be some combination of physical risk and transition risk. So they will certainly face some form of that. And the exact combination you face is uncertain. The exact timing of the crystallization of these risks are uncertain. But to some extent, this is a foreseeable problem. And the sort of which pathway we find ourselves on will depend on how countries and society, including the important role that the financial sector plays, responds to this problem. So PRI, for our part, we have developed our own house views on climate change. And as some of you may have seen, we have published a program called the Inevitable Policy Response. And so what this says is that markets today are not pricing in this risk. And it is inevitable because of the falling cost of the solutions, growing civil society unease about these extreme weather events, that governments will be forced to take more decisive action than they have so far to date. And moreover, that this program of work expects that this sort of policy jolt could happen within the next 6 years. So that's within the capex cycle of a number of kind of key industries in which investors are involved in. And so we have been putting together a program together with our partners, Vivid Economics, the Energy Transition Advisors, and others, which look to explain in detail the real economic impacts of this potential model and provide a portfolio screening tool for investors to look at the financial value at risk by asset class, by sector, and by country. Now, unfortunately, that model isn't available just yet. We're working on it, and it should be out Q1 of next year. But we hope this will be something that investors can use. And you may think, well, we don't quite agree with your view, PRI, and that, of course, that's fine. But what we do say is we do try to encourage our investors who are signatories to have a view on the future. How do they think this is going to play out? So talking about tools, PRI has been, over the years, been supporting a number of tools that are free to use and available. Now, of course, free doesn't necessarily mean the best tool, but it does provide a point where you can sort of start to really get into how this affects your portfolio or some of the companies you engage with. Highlight a couple. Over here is the Pactus Climate Scenario Analysis tool, which I'm sure in the Swiss market you're familiar with. There has now been over 1,000 users of this tool since it was launched 13 months ago. There's a Transition Pathway Initiative, which kind of approaches things in a different perspective, more from corporate engagement. And there are other tools that are available, such as Science-Based Targets, Carbon Tracker, more of a deep dive into the oil and gas and coal sectors. And so for investors, actually, one of the challenges is sort of which tool do I use? And once I've used these tools, how can I actually make sense of the results? And this is indeed a challenge. And so this is kind of a crude interpretation of the functionality which these free-to-use tools provide. And so one way of thinking about it is you have your portfolio screening tools, which I've included PACTA, and the Inevitable Policy Response. And then you have your company and sector engagement tools. And you can tease these apart by the types of outputs that they produce. So some produce an alignment test, that is the degree to which your portfolio aligns with climate targets. Some are around company engagement, that generate information that could be useful for your conversation with the corporates that you invest in. And then ultimately what you want to get to is financial analysis. Of course, it's the TCFD, not the TCD. But the challenge with that is that in order to arrive at financial analysis, you have to roll up your assumptions. And also, some of the providers don't have a license to offer investment advice, PRI, of course, being one of them. Those are some of the ones that are available. PRI, in terms of how we look to add value, is not just through guidance and tools, but also through the platforms which we help set up and run. And one of which you'll be familiar with is a Climate Action 100+. So this is now in its second year. 370 investors engaging 160 of the world's most energy-intensive companies. And I think this will probably come up in some of the discussions we hear later on. But it's worth reflecting on how is this doing? And it's clear to say that it is influential. You have seen some important developments, notably from the likes of Shell, from the likes of Equinor, Maersk, Glencore, and others. 12 public commitments from major companies in this area. So that's a sign of progress. On the flip side, that still leaves 149 who haven't made these commitments. And I think there are challenges around how you engage with state-owned companies in developing countries. Nonetheless, we do see that Climate Action 1 is going to be a very important vehicle for PRI going forward. There are other platforms which you could perhaps get into, such as the Just Transition, announced UN Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, which includes 11 asset owners, mainly asset owners, which have set a long-term goal to completely decarbonize their portfolio. So what else does PRI do on climate change? I think perhaps the third aspect is our reporting framework. When you sign up to the PRI, of course, one of the commitments that you make is to report to us on an annual basis. And since January of 2018, this has included TCFD-based indicator questions. So these are open and closed questions. There's around 20 of them. So it includes such as within your investment time horizon, describe the risks and opportunities you have identified, or does your organization have an organization-wide implementation plan? Please describe, yes or no. Those types of questions. So last year and the year before, it was voluntary to complete, and there was about 1,700 asset owners and investors who were eligible to respond to them. As we've already heard from Sabine, that next year, at least half of these questions will become requirements, so from January of next year. So let's take a look then at how investors have been responding. I think this is kind of an indicator of the rate of take-up of TCFD within your industry. So what you see here is 2018, 2019. And 2018, in orange indicates whether the investors in these countries responded to these indicators, and in blue indicates whether they did. So orange is no, blue is yes. And what you can see is around this year, as of the end of April this year, around 600 investors representing 49 trillion in assets responded. And actually, it's not just a European story. What we see is around 100 US investors reporting to us voluntarily. Also, Australia and Canada, two countries where the topic of climate change is politically charged, are within the top 5 response rates. And so that provides an indication of who is thinking about these types of issues and prepared to report to bodies like the PRI. So what we try to do this year is not only sort of a binary, have investors done this or not, but also to take an anonymous interpretation of the quality of disclosures by investor signatories. And so we have this sort of staircase analysis, which kind of borrows from TPI and also some work of the Bank of England. And so you have not reporting, responsive, responsible, and strategic. So not reporting kind of speaks for itself. If signatories provided a response to these indicator questions, but the response was private. Responsible was a public response, but there was some sort of missing information. And strategic is a public response. They indicate they publicly support TCFD. There's evidence that the board has approved a multi-year implementation plan, considers both short and longer-term climate risks, and have published targets. So what's clear here is that most of the PRI signatory base are on this side of the screen. But what we anticipate is over time, is as the TCFD framework matures and the cost of implementation comes down, that more investors will move to the right-hand side and up the stairs of this framework. I just want to reiterate that this is anonymous. We're not looking to call out anybody. It's just a frame of reference as to how to kind of benchmark yourself against your peers. I did mention other initiatives, and of course a very important one for PRI is the EU taxonomy. And whilst the implementation of this has been delayed, it's widely anticipated that this will come through at some point. So an important question is, well, EU taxonomy, TCFD, how are these similar? How are they different? And we've been doing some reflecting on this internally in PRI. And I think the first thing to say is they're designed to do different things. The EU taxonomy is primarily about providing a dictionary for activities which are green or not green for financial products, so green bonds, ESG funds. Whereas TCFD itself is assessing the entire portfolio of a fund or the entire operations of a company, not that's just labeled as green or sustainable. So in that sense, TCFD is about the greening of finance, whereas EU taxonomy is about the financing of green. There are some similarities. So TCFD is probably going to demand for better metrics. It's largely a non-prescriptive framework. And this is perhaps where the EU taxonomy can play a role in that this sets out some very detailed metrics, thresholds. So that the metrics that investors or companies look to report to under the EU taxonomy could also be used in a TCFD type report. Equally, the taxonomy could be a screening tool. So within the taxonomy itself, there are thresholds that go out to 2050 to allow for transition-related activities. So this could be used as part of climate scenario analysis. So this is going to be something that we'll look to develop, and we'd welcome your feedback and input on. But essentially, we do see some synergies between these two frameworks. So just a few points to leave you with. As you see here on the screen, I think there is clear momentum behind TCFD is building. If you're wondering what types of frameworks I should use, then for climate change, this seems to be the clear industry winner. And also, I think if you just focus on climate risk, there's a risk that your analysis can go wrong. So if you take the example of an insurance company, which generates a significant portion of their business from, say, automobile insurance, they may think, well, the transition from ICE vehicles to electric vehicles isn't going to have any impact. But in fact, it could, because the autonomous vehicles may reduce the need for individuals to take out insurance policies. So understanding these trends in relation to broader themes than just climate, I think is important, and that's something that my colleague Sheila will be speaking on in a moment. So that's all from my presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions if there are any.
As it's been a rather extensive overview on all these different activities, I'm sure there are some questions. Take the opportunity to have further insights. Anyone wants to break the ice?
Yes. My
Please.
name is Sasha Benasconi. I'm managing green bonds over here. So,
Can we have sound on the microphone here?
was not switched on. So my name is Sasha Benasconi. I'm managing green bonds. So I'm particularly interested in climate change. And I mean, I was calling since years, why do we need to report all this ESG stuff when you say the elephant in the room is climate change? If you don't address this, forget about the rest. So my question, even before the speech of your colleague, is, I mean, why bother about the rest again?
Yeah.
About the E, S, and G, when we don't address this, you can skip the rest. What's your point?
That's a great question. I think it's very tempting to have the singular focus. I think the reality is we see from implementation of policy in countries, perhaps neighboring Switzerland, is that unless you also consider social factors, there's a risk that the policy you're trying to implement won't be effective. And a transition does imply there'll be opportunities for investors, but equally it's going to be disruptive. And so I think it's important that the investment community and governments play a role to minimize these types of frictions. I completely agree with where you're coming from as a climate nerd myself, but I think it is important to look at this in a holistic perspective and not take a single issue view.
Hello, my name is Dorothea Bauer. Oops. I'm an independent consultant. I was just surprised to see that it's 65% of your signatories that do not respond, and I'm not really familiar with your strategy. I know it from UN Global Compact that there would be delistings. Is PRI similar in that regard, and are you explicitly focusing on carrots by building like a leadership group, but no sticks at all?
So great question. So I should explain that the climate indicators were voluntary in 2018 and voluntary in 2019 to report to. The reporting framework itself is not voluntary. And so what's happening as of January next year is that these indicators, the strategy and governance indicators, become a requirement to report to. So if, say, at the end of March, signatories who haven't responded to them, then it does go through the process of delisting. And that's one of the reasons why we're doing this type of outreach. We're trying to provide guidance so that we recognize the 1,400 or so who have yet to report to us, at least, on this journey, have the information that they feel that they need to answer the questions that we're asking them.
Any other questions? If not, thank you, Edward, for this, and we will move over to Sheila. Thanks again.
Hi, I'm sorry, I've sprained my ankle, so I'm going to sit. I hope you can see me, and I'm usually quite loud, so I imagine you'll be able to hear me. I would also like to thank our hosts, Zürcher Kantonalbank, and our partners, Swiss Sustainable Finance, for having us. My name is Sheila Whitley. As I was introduced before, I'm the fairly new director of ESG issues at the Principles for Responsible Investment. As Sabine noted, there are not it gets more early days on the SDGs in terms of tools and frameworks. So what I'm going to be presenting to you now is our thinking at the moment in terms of investor action on the SDGs. This is work that we're developing over the next few months, and those of you who are signatories to the PRI will be part of a consultation process on this. We'll be publishing an internal paper for PRI signatory consultation in January, and then as the frameworks and messaging evolves, this will be published in April. So I would also really welcome in the question and answer period also your comments on this, and also your experience in integrating the SDGs into your investment decisions and different actions you're taking around the SDGs, because it will be very, very useful for our work going forward. So just to begin, and sort of as Ed framed on the why. So, what do we think are the roles for investors in terms of the SDGs? We have a view that all investments influence outcomes in society and the environment, and that investors, as a result, have a critical role both in increasing positive outcomes and decreasing negative outcomes. And this is true in terms of the investment activities they have, but we would also argue that beyond the actions of individual investors, that really we are only going to achieve the SDGs if investors move at scale or as a critical mass. So we're saying they can make a substantial contribution, but also a systemic contribution. And of course, this is acting alongside governments and companies and other key actors. And we would say, and you've seen the numbers already on the slide that Ed presented, that PRI signatories in particular, given the scale of assets under management, can play a very critical role in this space. And PRI also has a mandate to do this. Some of you may be familiar. We published a blueprint in 2017 for our next 10 years of activity. Part of this was focused on the role of investors in terms of having a real-world impact, and for PRI to really provide the tools and approaches that can support investors who are seeking to have real-world impact. So just to give you a sense of where we're coming from on this, and this question I think we had from the audience also about sort of this, what's relevant in terms of existing ESG tools or ESG integration. So, and I'm sorry, normally if I stand, I move around and I like to point at things, so I'll try to do that while sitting. So on the right-hand side of this slide, this is really where a lot of the work of the PRI has been focused in terms of ESG integration, risks and opportunities, and that's really for investors. You know, you have the state of the world, and what is the impact of the state of the world on a portfolio in terms of risks and opportunities, and tools to that end for ESG integration. What we're talking about here is not moving away from this risk and opportunities framing, but adding to that with a view of the kind of key area for investors is to understand their investment portfolio and the outcomes that that has on the world. And that's in terms of positive and negative outcomes. I would argue that in the case of climate change, there's already some familiarity with this. If you look at what Edward presented already, if you look at some of the guidance for TCFD, there are questions in there about metrics and targets vis-a-vis greenhouse gas emissions. If you look at the Transition Pathway Initiative, there are metrics again in there about reductions of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. These are outcomes from portfolios in the world. So this is the left-hand side. And what we would argue is we need much better thinking, and as Sabine said, you know, data and frameworks that support us across the other SDG goals. I've put some information up there also on the definition of sustainability impact. Sabine mentioned the impact management project, that we are a member of the structured network, and so we're working with others really across the whole piece that I'm going to present in terms of tools and frameworks and definitions, so that as much as possible this work is harmonized, and that we can provide tools that are useful, again, like what Ed presented in terms of like which for what will they help you with, helping our signatories to triangulate to that. So in terms of our thinking, as I said, what we would argue is that to contribute to the SDGs, investors have to understand the positive and negative outcomes from their investment activities and related activities, and how to shape and change those outcomes. And our objective is really to provide tools, and we would call this around different investor actions, tools that signatories and others can use to this end. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the step 1, 2, 3, that you can see at the top of the slide, but this bottom box in gray are the areas that we're going to focus on. So what can investors do in terms of investment allocation? What can they do in terms of stewardship and engagement with companies? What can they do in terms of dialogue with policymakers and key stakeholders? And then also, you know, how can they work to disclose and report all of the above, both in terms of transparency, but also in terms of signaling to the wider market what different investors are doing and facilitating this, this kind of critical move for a larger group of investors to act. So in terms of this 1, 2, 3, and 4, this is the framework that we've been developing. And so what we would argue is that there are opportunities now for investors to look at their existing investment activities and practices and understand the collateral outcomes from those activities. So understanding the current positive and negative outcomes that are happening across current portfolios and current investment activities. Where investors might seek to contribute to the SDGs, we would then imagine and potentially expect that they would be setting policies and targets to that end, and communicating about those policies and targets. We then would be seeking for investors to look at, once they've set those targets, how will they achieve those targets and monitor progress against them, and there will need to be tools that support investors to do that at an individual level. And then we also need tools more at the system level, and some of these are already being developed, to track progress more broadly beyond the actions of individual investors. And we see this happening in some way as a cycle. So if you imagine that an investor could be in this first stage in terms of understanding and assessing collateral outcomes, both positive and negative, they may then move to set positive and to set targets in terms of SDG contribution, and then they would be seeking to achieve and monitor progress as individuals and as a group. And what we would argue is that impact at the level of the SDGs global goals. So the impact at the level of the SDGs is only happening at the global level when, as we said, or as I said, there's a critical mass of investors who are moving into this space. And globally achieving the SDGs alongside companies and governments. And as I said, what we're going to try to provide is at those stages 1, 2, 3, and 4, not necessarily guidance and tools that we will develop on our own, but working with partners to develop the tools that are needed. In some ways, we've seen with the TCFD on climate, we now have more and more sophisticated tools for the SDGs. In some cases, we're just beginning, but tools that will be relevant in terms of investment allocation, in terms of stewardship, in terms of policy engagement, and also in terms of disclosure and reporting, and that would include our own reporting framework. So I thought it was useful just to provide one case study. If you go onto the PRI website, we have a number of case studies on the SDGs, which have started first in terms of stewardship, so in terms of engagement with companies. This case study is of an investment manager. And just to get a sense of sort of where they were coming from, saying that they were seeking to have impact with regards to the SDGs, that they were then looking at what would be sort of the material issues that they would want to look at with regards to the SDGs, and the focus was on biodiversity and on climate change and also on change in diets, which I'm sure are a number of different issues that you're also looking at. What they then sought to do was to engage around these issues, and to engage around these issues in a way that's linked, let's say, to some of these, let's say, targets that might then be able to be triangulated back to the SDGs. So that's targets in terms of changes in product formulation, which, depending on how those products are formulated, could be related to the SDG Goal 3 with regards to good health and well-being. Then targets around sustainable proteins and antibiotics, and then finally targets around sustainable land use. And again, you could triangulate those back to Goal 15 on life on land and some of the SDG indicators. Now we know that not all of the SDG indicators are relevant, let alone investors, and so part of the work is really around the metrics and data and frameworks that we need to get that data that's relevant for investors. So that's all of my presentation. Thank you very much. I hope you have some questions, but also some feedback.
Well, thanks for these inputs, Sheila. I think it's the first time that speakers have been so much faster than planned. So we definitely want to drill in a bit and hear a bit more about the relevance for investors. Who would want to raise a question for Sheila? Yes, please. Can we have the mic? There you go. It's not on. Let me put it on for you. There you go.
Kevin Fox. I have a question regarding how you might be integrating statistics about the impact that particular SDGs events are having on companies, because I think that there's a major gap. I mean, you've got the implementation of using SDGs for investors. There's a mindset, and then there's an actual physical implementation. You've got to put the framework together, and then the question is why. And this is the work that I do with the Business School Lausanne, teaching classes on sustainable corporate finance. And what I'm bringing to the students is the why, the motivation. So from the governance perspective, we see statistically there's clear correlation in the markets. The other aspects, social, we're not there yet, but the environmental, there's plenty of single case examples. But from a statistical perspective for the investors, I think that would be a huge motivational factor to want to bring, why they should bring the SDGs into their portfolio analysis.
So for our, this flagship paper that I mentioned that will be coming out in January, initially for consultation, the part of that paper will look through sort of this why question of why might an investor move from one, understanding kind of these collateral outcomes, positive and negative, to setting targets and policies around contributing to the SDGs. And we would argue that there are a number of reasons why that would be the case, and we will be seeking to kind of look back to, and I'm very fortunate in our, we have an academic research network at the PRI, and my colleague who works in that has already been sharing papers with us with some of the evidence of why these decisions are being made. So we'll be trying to kind of reference back to the academic literature in that part of the paper about why some of, what are the different motivations and where is there evidence of this. But if you have suggestions of work that it would be good to reference, that would be great to have. But I do think this question of the motivation and the why, what we're saying is we're not expecting it to be one rationale, but we want to give a sense of the shifts. And again, we've heard already from Sabine this morning, this investors talking about the fiduciary duty component, and we're in parallel developing a legal framework for impact project that will look at this sort of the next phase of our fiduciary duty work around this question of impact.
Thank you. Manuel Hurl from Credit Suisse. I have a question about the whole taxonomy of different areas that are currently out there. You deliberately, I think, talked about SDG outcome rather than impact, but there's a whole conversation about impact investing, sustainable investing, now responsible investing. What do you see as the role of the PRI in bringing this all together, and where do you see this developing?
I guess we would continue, we are the principles for responsible investment, so we will continue to speak about responsible investment. In this case, what we're looking at is trying to provide, as I said, tools and frameworks for those investors who are now seeking to contribute to the SDGs. There are obviously tools in the impact investing space, and if you look at my favorite slide now from Ed's presentation, where he sort of had the green, yellow, and red boxes, what we'll be trying to show is where those tools, for example, from the impact investing space will be useful, where tools such as the EU taxonomy will be useful. So trying to, in some cases, I do think, we are working on a major initiative on driving meaningful data. We know that there needs to be more work on data harmonization. We'll have to do that with key partners, but I think there are existing frameworks and tools out there, so a lot of this will be pointing to those tools, pointing to how practice has worked in using those tools and making them relevant. But I would argue, and this is sort of my personal opinion, is that a lot of the impact investing tools have focused on those positive outcomes, and we need equal weight on the negative outcomes and understanding around that, and that's maybe some places where PRI might be doing things that are maybe new or adding some additional value.
Hello. So I work also for investors engaging with companies in these topics and sustainability. And what I'm facing is often a disconnect in between what investor wants and what the companies are providing. On the investor side, we have heard a lot. On the company side, we see mainly a mapping of the activities that the companies are currently doing with the SDGs. So what would be your suggestions on how we could bridge this gap?
I think it's a very good question. I guess what we're hoping, and perhaps this is naive, that if we are starting to potentially shift the investor expectations in terms of needing data on positive and negative outcomes, it may be that companies actually collect that data or report on that data already, but they're not yet thinking about how that connects to SDGs, or that this will, and I think, as you'll see, some of our first case studies were on engagements with companies. That means you have investors asking questions that push companies to provide this data, but we also know we need more harmonized systems for data disclosure. So we're really trying to connect this work on outcomes to work on corporate reporting.
Any more questions? If not, I would have one.
Yeah.
If you look at the taxonomy of the EU mainly on relating to green issues, they say a company or an activity will qualify if it serves one objective while not harming any of the other. Now, you mentioned yourself with regards to the SDGs, investors mainly focus about the upside and not so much on the downside. But if you think this through, we have 17 SDGs. If an investor wants to argue what's the upside on one and that there is no downside, no major downside on 16 others, would that be practicable?
So this is what we're exploring. So we've had some very interesting internal discussions and debates on this point in terms of what guidance we would be giving around our expectations around if you look at one goal from a positive perspective, do you have to then look at how that goal potentially negatively impacts on the others? And this may be what we are recommending. That you have to look, if you're going to choose to look at something positively, that you have to look at the negative outcomes that are related to that. That you also, we believe that particularly in terms of negative outcomes, there's a lot of tools also in the human rights space in terms of the UN guiding principles for companies and the related OECD guidelines for institutional investors. And obviously, there are ways to make very positive contributions in terms of human rights, but there's also very sophisticated thinking in terms of understanding negative outcomes related to human rights and remedying those. So we may also be kind of establishing expectations around sort of a minimum expectations around looking at negative outcomes, but this is the thinking that we're still doing internally and we'll be seeking feedback on.
Okay. And maybe one more question. You brought with you one example related to engagement. Could you bring another best practice example of how a company adopts the SDGs, maybe not on the engagement side, but on the investment and reporting side?
I don't think I'm best placed to provide an example. I'm sorry, I've only taken up the role leading the SDGs since August, and I have a great team who, if they were here, would be able to provide a good company example, but I don't know if anyone in the audience has a kind of strong company example. I do think, at least from what I've seen, it is a lot of mapping, and I think we need more depth in terms of reporting on positive and negative outcomes, but I don't know if others in the room have.
Well, we'll certainly dig
or
a bit deeper on the panel. There are companies on the panel that have track records in this field. But yes, thank you for this. So I think important for you is that the PRI will put this draft framework for consultation. When did you say that was?
So this will be out for our signatories to review at the end of January, and then it will be out in the public domain probably towards the end of April.
Okay. So I think we stop here with regards to the SDGs. Thank you very much.
Thank
Sheila.
you.
And I can now ask the panelists to the stage. We have to do a small arrangement here. Please join us. So, I'd like to welcome three distinguished experts here on the panel, all of which have a long track record in sustainable investments. And let me please introduce them to you first. To my left, there's René Nicolodi. He's head of equities and themes in asset management at Swisscanto Invest by Zürcher Kantonalbank. He's also deputy head of asset management. And before he started his career with UBS, he held several positions within Zürcher Kantonalbank, and he's also a lecturer on the topic of sustainable investments, but also on asset management in general at the University of Zurich, at AZEC, and namely also at the International Management Institute in Kiev. So you have insights into other investment realities there as well, I assume. We then have Claudia Bali from Swiss Re. She's head of responsible investing there in the asset management unit. Very important, she's also a member of the technical expert group of the EU Commission, and there has shaped the work on climate benchmarks. I'm sure you'll also talk a bit about this later. Previously, she was financial analyst at Swiss Re Admin Re, and before that, portfolio manager at Bank Leumi, I'm not naming all the functions because there were many. Then to her left, there's Tychos Nayers. I'm very pleased that he can be here with us today. He's managing partner at LGT Capital Partners and has served on the executive management team there since 2001. What struck me, he actually initiated and led the firm's ESG efforts since 2002. So a really long time, a really long track record on this subject, and has chaired the ESG committee since inception. He was elected to the PRI board in 2017, so now he's also steering the kind of work that we've seen presented. Prior to joining LGT Capital Partners, Tycho co-founded Altgate Capital, a research and advisory firm in alternative investments, and before that worked at Goldman Sachs and Anderson Consulting. So really a broad experience that we can build on when diving a bit deeper into the role of such frameworks. And I'd like to start with Claudia. You're not just on the tech. Swiss Re was also involved in the TCFD work. Swiss Re was one of the companies that helped shape the framework, and consequently, you were one of the first reporters according to TCFD. You started with TCFD reporting in 2016. Now, I'd like to hear from you, what was this experience? How has your TCFD reporting evolved since? And what were major barriers and challenges that you faced?
Yeah, I mean, that's true. So first of all, thank you for the invitation, being here. It's a great pleasure. With regard to the TCFD, yes, that was true. We participated and we still participate in the TCFD, so it's still an ongoing working group to further advance the project. And in 2016, it was kind of an obligation, right, to start reporting because we were part of that working group. And in that way, it was also a good way to test how feasible these recommendations are. And of course, at the time, for us, the starting point was more on a qualitative basis, so more description. How do we integrate climate-related opportunities, risk, analysis, and so on? And it was more from a generic point of view. And since then, we moved more towards being more specific, but also being more quantifiable. And I think this is also a reflection of how the industry evolves, is having more tools, more data, more methodologies which support the analysis. And I think that is also a reflection of how the whole industry evolved. However, I think as many other investors, we are still challenged with some requests from the TCFD in a way of like scenario analysis or metrics, right? I mean, at the moment you see a lot of carbon footprinting, and you also hear a lot of, yeah, it is backward looking. And of course, for us, it is a motivation to change that, moving more towards forward-looking indicators, not only to report on, but also to make better investment decisions, right? To make sure we participate in the transition to a low carbon environment. However, as said, I think the industry itself is not yet there in a way of like also providing the right, the much needed tools, let's say it like that. What I think is amazing is TCFD was one of the first one who provided a framework on reporting on, also gave guidance on what metrics should be used for measurement. And in that way, it helped a lot to increase already comparability. And in that way also quality. Focusing on which ones are the most important of the 4 pillars, as already mentioned, it increases comparability, so I think metrics, right? Because that is the easiest way to compare one company to the other one. Another thing for us as an investor is also the risk management reporting, due to better understand in what do we invest with regard to risks, right? So in that way, I also hope and recommend that as many as possible of companies report on TCFD, as it helps us as an investor to make these better investment decisions.
Thank you for this introduction of how you approach the challenge of TCFD reporting. I now switch to René. ZKB has introduced a sustainability indicator on fund fact sheets, not just for their own funds, but even for third-party funds as early as 2011. I know that one element of the indicator that you formed was actually carbon intensity. How have you built on this early work? How have you further developed this?
Well, maybe it's important to understand why we introduced such an indicator from the start. As you probably very well know, we had a very good platform built up over many years on ESG data and capabilities and in-house research, which was focused on a sustainability investment product offering mainly. And starting from 2009 and 2010, we had the strong feeling that we needed to broaden the impact and transparency and disclosure of all our investment strategies with regard to selected ESG topics. And if you want to broaden and, let's say, mainstream the topic, then you need to reduce the complexity. So our main ESG scores back then used over 100 indicators. That was just not, let's say, feasible to introduce as a simple metric. So we focused on what is really common sense, what do we really believe has a high relevance basically for all our clients and investors, what has a high relevance for all the portfolio managers, and what is easy to communicate to the outside world. So we reduced it to 3 metrics. We focused on carbon intensity, we focused on reputational risk, and we focused on corporate governance. We built up a score, basically, a very simple one, discussed it very intensively also with WWF and other stakeholders, and built up a metric that was introduced for all our portfolios, managed in-house, but as well for all the portfolios or third-party funds that we would offer to our clients throughout the bank. And we introduced this metrics in a very fancy, nice labeling, which you see on the energy efficiency label on fridges and TVs, which was very recognizable. And that had a major impact, being a very simple, easy, understandable label, but it had a big impact. And was the start to work with this data throughout the asset management investment world. So starting from the sustainability indicator, we used this kind of metrics, which were then established within the asset management area, to start integrate ESG data and information throughout our investment processes, starting from the equity side a few years back and going on the fixed income side. We then also integrated this data in all our reports for our private banking clients. So if you have an account with ZKB and you receive let's say a disclosure or a report on your investments, you will see the same logic built up on carbon, reputational risk, and governance throughout your portfolio. We will look through on all your positions, being own funds or third-party funds or single stocks or single bonds, whatever. So that was really a breakthrough. And that's, again, the start to go the next step, thinking what's next for integrating ESG data through all our investment process, build up the capabilities and skill sets on climate change, scenario analysis, forecasting, let's say 2-degree, 1.5-degree scenarios, and trying to build in this kind of data in our investment strategies.
And how far are you in this process?
I think we are pretty far with regard to integrating ESG data throughout our investment processes. We have a pretty clear target in mind with regard to 2 degrees target that we want to implement throughout all our investment strategies. And I guess we'll start with true implementation by the beginning of next year.
So far advanced. Yeah. Tycho, now over to you. We heard it in the brief introduction. LGT Capital Partners has different segments, but one of them is alternative investments, also private markets. I'd like to hear from you a bit how you integrate both climate factors and maybe broader SDGs in private markets, and do you have a special role as a private investor there? But of course also tell us something about how you generally integrate it.
Thank you, Sabine. And maybe you mentioned my own background, and at the end there was this short mentioning that I I spent some time at Goldman Sachs, and maybe some of you remember that the previous CEO of Goldman Sachs once made the comment that he believed that they were doing God's work. It was a very controversial topic. And I had a discussion with a couple of my Goldman Sachs alumni once, talking about, the fact that we are now, a group of people who are all active in ESG. And basically what I now say is that the 18 years I've been working in ESG is basically redemption for the 1 year that I spent at Goldman Sachs. So maybe that as a small addition to your introduction. So LGT Capital Partners, we are I'm not sure if everybody is familiar with the firm. We are not such a brand name as maybe the other two here on the podium. We are a mid-sized asset management firm. We are headquartered in the very large financial center of Pfaffikon, Schwyz, a bit further down the lake. We have a business where we manage both alternatives and mainstream investments, also from an ESG or sustainability perspective. My own background is more in private equity, so we manage about 30 billion in private equity investments. And I was one of the earlier people trying to also incorporate responsible investing ESG principles within a private equity environment, and we were one of the first private equity firms or firms with a significant private equity activity also to join the UN PRI in 2008. And I do think that, for example, private equity as an asset class in particular is very well suited to address ESG sustainability issues, to address the SDGs. As private equity, I would say, has three characteristics that really lend them very well for that. One is it's long-term oriented. So, private equity managers typically hold companies for multiple years, and if you want to make changes, if you want to make a company more sustainable, you do need time for that. So that's the first element, what really works in favor of private equity. Secondly is private equity tends to have control, not in all situations, but the majority of the capital that private equity managers deploy is in buying companies, is in buying a majority stake into a company. So they control the board, they can control the strategy, they can set the incentives, they can decide on the KPIs. So a very important part is that control, which in public markets, let's be honest, very hard to buy control of most of the large publicly traded companies. So the control is a very important element. And the third element is that private equity is mainly funded by pension funds. And this agenda of sustainability, this agenda of the SDGs is definitely an agenda that also resonates with pension funds as the main provider of capital to the private equity community. So private equity, I would say, is very well suited to be a driver of these topics. There are also some issues. One is data. We talk about lack of data often for public companies. Well, I can tell you it's even harder when you deal in the world of private equity. Availability of data is an even bigger issue there. And secondly, there's also an issue of converting many of these private equity managers to take this agenda serious. And that's something where I've been working on now for a long time. And we've kept statistics on that topic since 2013, 2014. We have a very large portfolio of private equity managers, over 200 of those. And we ask them every year, we rate them every year on what they're doing on ESG. And we're really looking for institutionalization of ESG practices in their investment activity. So we want to see real proof that they incorporate ESG in how they look for companies to buy, how they act when they own these companies. Is it part of their 100-day plans? Is it part of the board meetings? Are ESG topics a KPI they give to management? And of course, in the last phase, in how they report back to their own investors. And if we look at the last 6-7 years where we've had that data, and that's globally, we see that 2014, there was about a quarter of our private equity managers who had really institutionalized ESG. If we look at it today, we see that it is basically almost 3/4 of managers who have institutionalized ESG within their own investment business and activities. So clearly progress, but we're definitely not there. We do see in the US significantly less uptake on that topic than if we compare it, for example, to Europe and also to Asia. So Asia is, in the private equity world, definitely more advanced on ESG incorporation than the US is. And that partly has to do with the fact that quite some development institutions like the World Bank, the IFC, played a role in the establishment of the private equity universe, for example, in places like China. So we do have a lot of work to do, and we see our role as a large allocator into the private equity world also. We see engagement and education as an important role in bringing that agenda to the wider world of private equity.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that it is facing increasing interest among your institutional clients, the pension funds. Do you see this growing demand to take ESG factors into account amongst Swiss pension funds too?
Definitely. Swiss pension funds, you could say, I mean, clearly the leaders in the field have always been the Nordics. I mean, on the SDGs, definitely the Dutch, as was mentioned before, the Australians. These are the parties that have really driven that agenda to where we are today, where, I mean, ESG incorporation is, I think, for most pension funds, a very important topic. And we have also seen that in the Swiss pension fund market, which is, I mean, it's not my area of expertise, but clearly also there we do see a clear interest today in furthering that agenda, in incorporating more and more themselves. But I would say Switzerland, Germany have been a bit behind other parts of Europe who have been faster in incorporating it. And then we're talking mainly about Northern Europe. So that's definitely the case.
So one of the drivers in this. I'd like to dig a bit deeper on the technical aspects of how you report on this. Scenario analysis is one of the key words. And I know you even mentioned it, that Swiss Re has already worked on scenario analysis. Could you maybe tell us a bit how you do it? What did you report on with regards to scenario analysis, and how is it actually done? I think it scares quite a lot of investors.
It scares me too, to be honest. So what we already did is on the real estate side, we analyzed our real estate portfolio with regard to scenarios. And we did that in collaboration with our underwriting team or department, who are very advanced in climate change analysis, risk analysis. They already stated 30 years ago, right, that climate change becomes an issue for the world. And it's a clear driver also because we as a reinsurance business, we insure climate change impacts, right? So in that way, we as a company have a huge interest in managing that, in analyzing that, and that is one of the drivers why our underwriting business also developed certain models. And what we then do, or what we did with regard to the real estate portfolio, is you cannot just say, or what we had to learn is, you cannot just say you have a real estate portfolio in a certain country and how high is that exposed to climate risk. It's really about the address. So they really had to go through our whole investment portfolio, address line by address line. Where is the building really located? Is it closer to the coastal, or is it more in the inner side of a country? Is it more closer, let's say, to the middle of the earth, or is it more in the north? Because you're then exposed to different risks. And then the materialization of this risk and the probability are different ones. So in that way, that is what they analyzed for us. How much is our real estate portfolio exposed to the various risks, and do we need to change anything? And we reported on that in the last TCFD, and of course these are analyses which we would like to further progress also for our listed assets such as fixed income or equities. However, it's even more complicated there because it's not just an address line analysis. You really need to go into, okay, what is the main business of this company? Where do they have the various locations? Which part of the whole process is impacted by climate change? And to be honest, if we would like to do that on our own, I think we would need to hire an army of people, right? So what we currently do is we screen the markets for data provider who could help us with providing the information and the models we are looking for. And our experience until now is there are not that many. Many people talk about it, or many companies talk about it, but when you really dig into what do you deliver, what is the outcome of the analysis, usually it's not very satisfying from a perspective that you say, okay, this risk analysis helps me to manage my portfolio. So in a way of like not only having a marketing tool and say, yeah, we did climate change scenario and that is our result, but really that you have a tool where you can manage your investments. That is at least our experience until now.
Manage your investment with the objective of reducing risks. In that case,
of course,
more focused on the risk side, not so much on the outcome or impact side.
Let's say
understand you correctly.
Yeah, I mean, let's say it that way. I would say climate change is for us mainly a risk component, which we try to manage. I mean, that is our first mandate as an asset management from a reinsurance company, right? We need to make sure we have the money ready in case a client has a claim that we can pay out. So that is maybe a little bit different story behind than, let's say, an asset management who is a pure portfolio manager. And that way we look more on the downside and to avoid such risks. And in that way, that is our main focus, right? Making sure we have a clear understanding what is the climate change risk in our portfolio. Do we need to change something? How could we manage it actively? And then, of course, as a next step, it's also opportunities, right? There are always opportunities by shifting business, by transitioning to a low-carbon environment. But that is, for us, a smaller portion, right? The risk assessment goes across the whole universe, but this goes for me a little bit in the direction of impact investing, is for sure a smaller portion.
Mm-hmm. But if I hear you correctly, you don't give a green light. You say there is a lot of complexity. There is no easy way in coming up with scenario analysis. Before you said ZKB chose a very simple way of addressing the topic. How have you moved forward? And you mentioned the data providers too. I know you looked at many data providers recently. Where do you see opportunities?
Well, what I mentioned earlier was the indicator that we use for transparency reasons and disclosure reasons for our fund fact sheets and reportings. Then on the investment side, obviously we use more complex models. We are on the buy side. We are responsible for 180 billion Swiss francs assets under management for institutional investors. So we need to have obviously the right kind of data in place, first of all. And then I think we have a few beliefs. One belief is that the analysis needs to be done in-house. So we don't outsource the analysis and the investment decision. So yes, we use raw data. Yes, it helps us to do quantitative pre-screenings, better understandings, getting closer to the decision-making process. But at the end of the day, the portfolio manager and the analyst needs to do his own scenario analysis within a framework which is established as a good framework, but needs to do the homework in order to do good investment decisions. That's a key. And then obviously, this kind of investment decision-making processes do not look alike for equities or bonds. On the equity side, yes, I look at the risk, but I also look at the upsides. On the bond side, if I buy a 5-year bond of any company, let's say an insurance, scenario analysis on climate change might be a big relevant point, but maybe not, because in the next 5 years, nothing will really happen to this 5-year bond, and I will get my capital back, and I will be happy. So you need to be very, very asset class specific in what you do in your daily work. Then on an upper level, if we think about integrating climate change on a strategic level over all our asset classes and bring our asset management, let's say, production machine in alignment with a 2-degree target, let's think like that, then obviously you need to have a bigger scenario analysis framework that works for the whole of your assets. And then we are currently thinking about different metrics and logics and concepts, and I think we are ready to implement something very interesting by the end of the year and starting next year. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In terms of implementation and the way you guide these topics, how do you do it at LGT? Do you have concrete targets already, even quantitative targets for your portfolios?
No, depends which portfolio, because it is, as Renee said, of course, very asset class specific. And we also manage portfolios ranging from private markets to fixed income portfolios to public equity portfolios. So it is very different for each of these portfolios. Also, do they have a dedicated sustainability mandate or not? We are a mainstream asset manager, so for us, achieving investment return is still our number one goal. But we want to do it across our portfolios, ideally with optimizing the positive impacts, the positive footprint we leave on society and on the environment, and minimizing all the negative externalities or the negative impact that investments might have. So that as an overall goal. Of course, for the dedicated sustainability portfolios, there are also clear targets, for example, when it comes to emissions targets we have, but it's very asset class specific. I'd say overall for us, we look at what we think is, trying to get as much of a holistic picture of an investment as we can, and that then has to do with the operations of a business. And we try to, just like my colleague at ZKB, we try to buy lots of data, different data points for how does a company run their operations. Then we also try to get a very good understanding of the footprint of the products and services that a company provides, and that we link to the SDGs. So we really try to understand, are the products and services that a company provides, do they have on average a positive impact to each of the 17 SDGs, or do they have a negative impact on that? And we do that analyzing the different revenue streams a company has, and basically mapping those revenues either positively or negatively to each of the 17 SDGs. And then what we also do is, I think, like no doubt a number of people here in the room, work with rep risk to really understand, have a bit of an independent overlay of the portfolio to understand which of our investments are negatively mentioned in the news pertaining to ESG controversies. And basically, particularly in private equity, that is very useful because you don't have that much information on private equity. So having a continuous screening of all types of news sources pertaining to ESG controversies on our entire private equity portfolio, which is over 6,000 companies, is a very good tool to make sure that when we're saying that we're trying to hold our portfolio to certain ESG and sustainability principles, that we're also living that by seeing that, none or very, very few of those 6,000 companies are mentioned in the news pertaining to some kind of ESG controversy.
Mm-hmm. The PRI states that investors can play a role with regards to the SDGs mainly through 4 means: investment allocations, you mentioned it, stewardship of investments, so the whole engagement part, which is important, especially with private equity, then dialogue with policymakers and disclosure, which many of you mentioned also. So which of these tools do you find most effective, and in which ones have you already used?
Well, I believe that you need to think hard about the combination of these tools. So there's not one single magic bullet that leads you to the final target. It's the combination. At the end of the day, I'm a strong believer in active management. So the capital allocation function, even in a world that gets indexed and benchmarked a little bit more every day, I still believe that the capital allocation function of asset managers is a key responsibility that we have as an industry to do that. At the same time, capital allocation alone is probably not enough. So engagement instruments, be it proxy voting, be it the active dialogue behind and in front of the curtains with companies is very important. Let's make an example. We are obviously a Swiss asset managers. We hold large stakes in Swiss companies, and we have direct access to basically all the boards of all large Swiss companies listed in the main indices. So there, as an owner of this fiduciary owner of these companies, we have a direct impact. We can talk to them, but we can also allocate our capital in a way that it feels right to do, also with regard of the relevant and important E, S, and G topics.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Claudia?
I would say I would go for something which is not yet listed. But that is the Swiss review on sustainability, SDGs. From our understanding, SDGs are really linked to intentionality. And what we currently see is there's a huge promotion of the SDG-related investments in the market. And with that, there is a certain risk that you will invest into something which is linked to SDGs, but which misses the attribution or the motivation of intentionality. What I think is anything which goes into the space of SDGs should start from a project point of view, in a way of like, okay, you want to make this real world impact, which I think was already mentioned by PRI. And then you have this project and that needs to have finance, right? It needs money. And to get that money, then you can issue a linked asset to it. And that I would call an SDG asset. But if you do it the other way around, in a way of like, okay, we need some money, and at the moment, SDGs are very well absorbed in the market, let's map some projects just to do these assets, then we can name it SDG investments, I think is not, for us at least, the right approach. And it goes a little bit in the same direction as we experience with green bonds or with some green bonds. And what helped the green bonds was these frameworks, just to name one or two, the ICMA standards, right, or the EU standards, which are coming up pretty soon. Just two examples. And I think that is something which is currently missed when we talk about SDGs. A clear framework where you also have your steps to go through that you can name your investment an SDG investment. And with that, to give the assurance that you really have a clear intention to have a real world impact with the money you give or with the investments you do. And that way, that would also help us to increase quality, it would increase accountability, and it would increase comparability. And so I hope one or two initiatives or organizations might pick that up and release a framework in the near term.
Well, one of them is probably in the room and will hopefully work more on standardizing this. But this brings us to an important point, further standardization in terms of data, in terms of processes.
Can I maybe still react to, because
Please.
I have a slightly different view on the topic, if I can maybe bring some disagreement into the panel, and then happy to answer your next question, but I think we have a bit of time, so.
Absolutely.
I see where you're coming from, and obviously it makes complete sense to say when we are when you have capital that you want to dedicate to the SDGs, to focus on the intentionality and to focus on what I understand is really high impact and a very clear impact. And I think that is definitely an important part of the capital that is currently addressing the SDGs. But I also think that it's probably not realistic to address a substantial percentage of the capital of asset owners and asset managers in the world into that philosophy. I think most investors in the end have a mainstream equity or fixed income portfolio for the bulk of their assets. And I do think it is also important to think about how can you address the SDGs with that more mainstream portfolio. And I think very easily people then start using the words rainbow washing or greenwashing because people, and some people might also really, engage in that topic. But I think in general we have to be very careful with negatively talking about people who are trying to steer also their mainstream portfolio into a more positive impact on the SDGs. And impact, some people use that as very high intentionality, very high additionality, very clear. But from my perspective, you can also use impact for negative or positive outcomes of your mainstream equity portfolio. And I do believe if you take now the 89 trillion I saw as the latest update, the PRI members manage 89 trillion. If that $89 trillion starts slowly moving towards listed equities, towards bonds that minimize the negative impact and start looking at optimizing the more positive impact towards the SDGs, that will have an impact. It will have an impact on the cost of capital of these companies. It will have an impact on the incentive systems of the people running these businesses. It will have an impact on the long-term success of these businesses. And in the end, the businesses that are marginally more sustainable will become more successful. The businesses that are marginally less sustainable will become less successful. So for me, it's not one or the other. I think we need to do both. The world has many, many challenges, and we need all capital to contribute to that, small amounts of capital with high impact, but also large amounts of capital with possibly low impact.
I think it's good to hear this strong call for SDG investing in listed market from the specialist of private markets on the panel.
We also do listed,
I know.
Yes, it's not my background.
Maybe a reaction from your side.
No, I totally agree. I mean, we have very focused sustainability strategies where the SDG focus is on high impact companies, where we look at the products, at the services, where we really want to build concentrated high impact portfolios on the equity, on the bond side. Then we manage other 160 billions in different strategies. There, the institutional investors, the pension funds that were mentioned before, are simply not ready to invest like the whole strategy in a highly concentrated, high impact portfolio now. That's simply the reality. The discussions that we have now with our large institutional investors are about risk return. And in as much certain ESG topics help them to achieve certain risk return objectives that they have, or minimize certain reputational risk by excluding certain common sense industries like cluster munition, as an example. So the level of discussion going from minimal requirements integrated in a traditional risk return context up until high impact SDG related, the differentiation between different client needs is quite large. And we, as a large asset manager, need to be able to work on all the dimensions of the needs of our clients.
Can I add a thought? I mean, let's say it that way. I think we are all aligned on when it comes to the high impact investing, right? Where I think we do not yet have and I think not only we, I think that is a good reflection of the market. Where we are is on these low impact SDGs. And why we have a concern at Swiss Re on, let's say, considering pharma companies as impact investing is just in a way of like how you can measure it, or what, when you measure it, right, what is the impact from one year to the other on a certain region by, let's say, a pharma company selling medicine, how much has this region changed or improved, right? And that is where I say, if that would mean we do impact investing since investing exists somehow, right? Because you find always companies who have an impact in the world. And then the question for me would be, okay, if we already do that, why do we still have then an issue in the world? And why does the UN still need to develop these goals and say we have an imbalance in that way, right? If we already do that since ages and ages, I'm surprised why we still have this need for the sustainable development goals. And that's the reason why I would say if we progress or do the same things as we have done in the past, and the impact was not as big as that we could solve these challenges, these 17 challenges, I think maybe that was just not enough. And therefore, maybe we should more focus on high impact to really make sure we achieve the goals defined under these 17 SDGs.
I see this, but
if you want to, I'll happily, because I think you're right. I mean, clearly, not enough has been done. I think no one says here that the average investor in public markets is doing enough to help the SDGs. I fully agree with you. And we did quite some detailed analysis of the MSCI World and how the 1,600 stocks of the MSCI World impact the SDGs. And obviously, fully agree with your comment, I mean, the impact is negative. So the average MSCI World portfolio leads to a negative impact on almost all of the SDGs except for 3, 12, and 13. Sustainable cities, responsible consumption, and health and well-being. I'm not sure if I got the numbers exactly right, but those 3. So at least in our model, you see, and that's partly due to pharma companies that do have an impact on good health and well-being, but there is a negative impact on almost all the other SDGs. And what we're saying is, and we did some own modeling, if you take those 1,600 stocks and you reduce that to a portfolio of 500 stocks, still not a very concentrated portfolios, and you keep the exact same sector weights. So we're not, because it's very easy to play, of course, with sector weightings and create portfolios that's significantly more sustainable by, going out of, gas and oil and gas or energy production. But you keep the exact same weightings to these various different industries in the MSCI world. But by purely selecting the better companies and by avoiding the worst companies, you have a significantly better, what I would call SDG footprint of your global equity portfolio. And is this the solution to all problems? Absolutely not. But it is another important step for this, 89 trillion that PRI members control, to basically start implementing that. And that by no means, do I imply that people shouldn't be doing what you're doing? I think that's, of course, great. Investors who have a lot of capital and who want to put that behind very high impact projects, that's for sure great. But we also need to push people who cannot do that, who are not yet ready to do that, to do smaller steps with a large amount of capital.
I really like the term SDG footprint that you just put in the room. But coming back to standardization, we hear there are a lot of different data providers, there are a lot of organizations that try to make it more tangible. Where do you see important initiatives in terms of standardization? And do you also engage, if we look at the dialogue with policymakers, do your organizations also engage with some of these players for standardization?
Well, I believe that with regard to standardization, I'm quite hesitant when it comes to the standardization of investment processes. I think that the world of investment processes should not be standardized, because it's a source of innovation and progress, and it helps produce, hopefully, better solutions for our clients in the future. So there, I don't see the need of big standardization on the investment process level. Where standardization is important is with regard to data at the end of the day. And so we are back to the disclosure element. The more the data is comparable, the more the data points are defined, well-defined, the better we can work within investment processes, and then make our own proprietary scenario analysis, investment cases, apply this data into our different asset classes, and hopefully produce products that are in line with what we call high, low SDG impact, whatever the clients also need or the regulator needs. Maybe on an industry level, on a general level, we could argue about minimal standards, about certain barriers that the regulator or the industry association think are good practice to have implemented as an asset manager or as a pension fund or as an insurance. And there I see a lot more movement, and I think that's something that makes sense for the long term.
And which organizations, in your view, should play a major role in making this data more aligned?
Well, I think the PRI is one, obviously. It has 2,600 signatories, a lot of assets under management that have signed, so it has quite a big role to play and pushing certain standardization on the disclosure level forward. Then on a national level, you have basically a lot of industry associations in the insurance, pension fund, asset management and banking world, having a good coordination among these players with regard to the standardization of disclosure and data for investments would certainly help the discussion.
For investments and for companies, the underlying investments, who should work towards aligned data?
I mean, as you mentioned, right, I'm part of the European Commission's Technical Expert Group, and that is composed of people from companies, so the industry. You have also regulators or more governmental related people, but you have also people from NGOs. And my experience is with this technical expert group, I think that is a great combination. It shouldn't be just one organization. It should be a collaboration between the various players in the market to make sure that all A, agree on what is developed, and B, also that you can really implement it and that it is meaningful. Because if just one party works, maybe it doesn't have a meaning, or if another party works, maybe you cannot implement it, or it is not feasible, or the data is missing. So in that way, we all have a knowledge and come from a different side. And bringing all that knowledge and experience together, I think that is the best way to assure that you really have a solution which adds value to the whole process.
Anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that obviously we need to get to a situation long term where all of the negative and positive consequences of financial investments are measured somehow in accounting standards. But yes, there's the Corporate Reporting Initiative, and also PRI is trying to play a role in bringing some of these initiatives together. And we've tried to bang some heads there, but it is very difficult to bring the various, bodies, I won't name any names, but the various bodies who are working in this field all have their own agendas, and it is very hard to get a unified approach to some of these topics. And I have to be honest, I don't see that happening, I would say, anytime soon. So I think that complexity will stay around for quite some time. And I think the other topic with standardization is that you have sometimes so many different initiatives trying to standardize that it leads to the opposite. So I think there are so many acronyms, and I hear it often also from our clients that their board asks about, who is dealing in this field, and then you have a list of 15 acronyms, and people are paralyzed by that. People rather do nothing than select one of those 15 without any clear reason why to select one of those 15. And I think that is, for us as an industry, I think also something to think about. Do we really need another initiative, or can we just join forces with other initiatives and make that initiative stronger? And yeah, in the end, this is all still fairly early in its development, particularly pertaining to the SDGs. And I think we have some work still to do there. And PRI obviously is playing an important role and has to continue playing an important role in that, in streamlining a lot of the work and bringing some of those initiatives hopefully closer together.
I would now like to give you the chance to already raise some questions and yes, try to clarify further issues or even make some comments. Who would want to make a start? There's one here again with Kevin.
I have a question regarding proactive measures. So typically we think about proactivity, from the private equity, we hear how the managers are managing their portfolios, how they're working with the boards. From the public assets, it's about engagement or divestment. I know from the insurance perspective, there are programs that are being put into place to deal with communities to help them become more aware of climate change, even on a city level. Could you expound a little bit more what you might see in the marketplace, how the investors are taking even a more proactive role? Because on the one side, we can measure what's going wrong in the world. On the other side, we can talk about what's going wrong in the world, and then we need to actually do more to make that change happen if we think that it's not enough.
Well, what we see is that the number of institutional clients, we are largely Swiss-based for Swiss clients and asset management for Swiss clients, that the number of institutional investors that require the integration of ESG aspects within their investment strategies has increased dramatically over the last 3 years. So if we look at the number of balanced mandates that we produce for these clients, I would say 50% to 2/3 are now with an integration of ESG layers. Often, even quite a strong, higher impact ESG strategy behind it. That's one element of clear indication that things are changing, and they're changing proactively, because there isn't actually a law in Switzerland that drives this trend. It's more I would say, a macro feeling and that we need to act. Then the other element that is kind of proactive is that we get a lot of quite a few requests by pension funds to screen their portfolio in relation to controversies, but also in relation to CO2 relative carbon intensity to their benchmarks, because they want to understand better for their boards what kind of measures and instruments they could implement as a next step. So they're preparing the discussions for their boards in order to be able to make implementation of instruments or tools or analysis or strategies for the future. This is also proactively, and this has increased over the last 2 or 3 years quite sensibly. Yeah.
Maybe I can add to that from what we see then from a global perspective. We did a survey with our institutional investors. In the end, we had about 220 replies from 28 countries asking about how they look at ESG and the SDGs. And I would say there were 3 main conclusions. One was that a very positive view towards the SDGs, I think as was mentioned, I think by Sheila before, from institutional investors, so also from our survey, that most of them clearly see a role for the SDGs in their investment management activities. But then secondly, very few are really actively doing something. Everybody is either mapping or thinking about it or discussing it, but really actively allocating capital behind it was still a fairly small number. About 10% of the participants were really actively putting capital behind. I mean, either impact teams like you mentioned them, or very clear SDG teams. But then 28% of them are planning to do that in the next 2 years, which was a very positive surprise. And although I'm not saying necessarily that they will all succeed in doing that, but still the intention of 28% of, I mean, yeah, let's call it the global pension community, to start actively allocating capital to these types of topics, I think is quite interesting. So I think there is a lot of work being done currently by people, and that hopefully will bear fruit in the years to come.
Another question from the audience.
Hello? It's working? Hi, my name is Andy. I'm doing a PhD at the University of Zurich in law, and I'm looking in detail at all these initiatives. Thank you for all these insights. I have a question specifically with regard to something we have not spoken so much so far. It concerns FINMA. If I'm not mistaken, you're all regulated or supervised by FINMA. And climate change is also a financial stability issue, at least that's the view of the Financial Stability Board and the European Central Bank and others. At the same time, we don't hear anything, or at least I don't, from FINMA. What is your view on that? Would you welcome guidance from FINMA, or what is your view on that? Thank you.
I mean, I'm not absolutely not a specialist in the field, but from my perspective, if you take more the Financial Stability Board, hosts the TCFD. So clearly the TCFD is very much linked into the FSB. So I would look at the main guidance coming from there is really the TCFD guidance that we have all received. That would be my answer. I don't know if, you are the TCFD expert here, but at least to me, that is, if you take the view of the FSB, this is their initiative.
Well, I would say that we have all noticed that the political changes happened over the last few weeks in Switzerland, and even before that, I believe we've seen certain movements by FINMA and also the National Bank in a certain direction. I'm not saying these are huge or big steps, but certain movements and trends in a certain direction that ESG aspects and in particular climate change issues are a little bit higher on the agenda right now. And I would bet some money that these topics will probably get a little bit more higher in the agenda in the next months, also among FINMA. And then obviously it's a question of resources, know-how, skill set, competencies that you need to have in order to implement such kind of topics into a regulatory framework, which by itself is quite complex and needs to be adapted to different kind of needs and stakeholders and many other topics. But the discussion in this area is, in my opinion, is advancing, yeah. even if you haven't heard specifically something from Prima right now.
Yeah, what could maybe be mentioned as well is that the International Association of Financial Market Regulators has just published a paper recommending that regulators actually look at climate risks in terms of market stability in their respective markets. I guess such papers will also leave a trace, and you may know that FINMA has joined the Network on Greening the Financial Systems just in April this year. They are now a member of one of the work groups. I'm sure they will also learn of the roughly 40 or 50 peers they have in the NGFS now. I agree with you, it will probably take some time, but an important aspect, definitely. Other comments or questions? I'd like to hear a bit more about the role of transparency. I mean, we talk about providing transparency on portfolios, but we also talked about impact. So where's the bridge between transparency and impact? Do you think, I mean, you mentioned at the beginning, you introduced this indicator for your fund fact sheet, and one of your comments was that it had a strong impact. Did it influence your clients in choosing different funds? Do you think the fact that you as service or as financial service providers offer transparency actually influences clients?
I think transparency is one of the main elements of behavior change. If we talk about risks, if I'm phrasing you an element or a question in a certain way, if I'm putting you the risk very transparently in your face, you will probably react to it. If I define it in another way and show it to you, you will react differently. So yes, disclosure, transparency on certain topics in a hopefully standardized way will have an effect on your behavior. That's behavioral economics at the end of the day, because it has an impact. Definitely, yes, I believe that.
Has it changed client conversations, the fact that you have this indicator on the fact sheets?
It has changed clients' conversations, definitely. And at the same time, you need to embed transparency into an advisory process. And then we open an whole other area of complexity. How you embed this kind of data, information into an advisory process, how you teach and educate all your relationship managers to able or enable them to have the right kind of discussion with the clients without just pushing in the products that are in flavor at the moment. So that's another level of complexity. You need to address both transparency level, process level, and product level.
How would you say that these can be combined? I think you mentioned an important point. MiFID II will ask financial service providers to really ask their clients what their preferences are, but that means you need to be able to match your products to certain preferences. How deep should financial service providers go there? Should they ask a client, do you prefer water investments over energy investments, or would you want us to engage instead of exclude? Where do you see an optimal solution?
Ladies first.
Thank you. Personally, I think it depends, right? We already raised the topic about SDGs, impact. So I think that is a lot about motivation. Where do you want to see your money goes to? But I think also sustainability has a different angle, which we already touched a little bit with climate change, and which we already raised as well with ESG. From my perspective, ESG is a pure I would say a pure risk parameter, right? So in that way, if you ask your investor, or also we as an investor, we look mainly into the ESG component. So we manage $180 billion US. We switch to ESG benchmark. We apply ESG criteria where no benchmarks is available. And we do that because of risk considerations. And what we also learned is when you do that, you can improve your risk-adjusted returns. And that means for an investor, it is important to take these things into account. But the SDGs for me is more a motivation or an interest thing, right? So maybe what I would hope for when I go to a bank advisor is that he asks me two questions. One question is, do you want to have assessed your ESG risk, because that might have a positive impact in a way of risk return? And do you want to put your money more into the direction of SDG or have a real world impact. So that is what I would hope for.
I think that transparency is very important just because in the world of finance, we like to measure things. If we don't measure it, we don't manage it. And we've come up in the last 20, 30 years with all these very sophisticated ways of measuring risk and return, all these ratios, Sharpe ratio, Sortino ratio, and I mean, yeah, no doubt a huge number of more complex ratios. But when it comes to the impact that an investment has on society, we basically have no measures. So, and I think that all starts with transparency. And I think if we want to get institutional investors to really move, they need to know where they stand. You need to know where, and that's also why I use the word footprint, but where is your ESG footprint, where is your SDG footprint, and what is your plan to bring that over the years to a different endpoint? I think that's a very different discussion that you then have in investment committees and in boards. And if you don't have that basic transparency, then yes, then we keep on discussing about things, but there is no concrete plan. And that's why I think what you mentioned before is also something that we spend a lot of time on, is for institutional investors. In the end, most pension funds don't really have an understanding of the ESG profile of their portfolio. They don't have an understanding, for sure, not when it comes to the SDG profile of their portfolio. And although all these methodologies to get there might not be perfect, it's very important to start and to tell someone, this is your portfolio, here is where your portfolio, how you compare to a benchmark, because I mean, we do this compared to the client's benchmark. So the Swiss pension funds obviously have a different benchmark from the English pension funds versus the Australian pension funds. And so you can show them whether their ESG footprint or their SDG footprint is better or worse, and in which areas they underperform or outperform, and what they can do to basically improve. And that then becomes a much more tangible discussion. And I think that's where we need to get to. And we don't have that transparency on all topics, but as I always tell people is don't let the lack of data or the lack of accurate data prevent you from starting to do things, because it will be a very long time before we have accurate data on all different data points, and the world is just not in a situation where we can sit back and relax and wait until we have that data coming to us. So we need to start now, and it is definitely possible to start now. Look at where you stand and craft a plan for the future.
This plan for the future has been crafted by the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance that was mentioned by Edward too. Do I remember it correctly? The Swiss Re is part of it. So how do you plan to go ahead there, or what are first objectives of this group? You want to demonstrate the carbon intensity of the portfolio and bringing it to zero?
Maybe first, I think it's an amazing initiative because it tackles already a few things raised, right? I mean, it was mentioned, right? Do we need to have another initiative? Does that make sense? And so on. And I think the aspiration of this initiative is not to create a known goal or develop own methodologies, but really bring different initiatives together and make use of them, right? And in that way, leverage it. That's one thing which I very much like with this alliance. The second thing is what I saw in the past in the market. It was either about SDGs, about ESG, about climate change, right? The topics were usually differently discussed, analyzed, and implemented. And this alliance has the aspiration to tackle climate change, but under a holistic ESG approach, right? So in that way, they really try to bring these various concepts and ideas together, which I think is great, right? You cannot just manage on one piece and ignore all the other ones, because then it goes also a little bit in the direction which was mentioned before at the PRI presentation with this do no significant harm, right? If you just focus on climate change, you might have a negative impact on some social components, right? So in that way, I think that's also another advantage of this alliance, really try to bring all these pieces together. The aspiration is, or the goal setting is having a net zero greenhouse gas emission portfolio by 2050. And the goal is to be achieved not by divesting mainly, which I also like very much, and which I think is also a very nice reflection of the market. 5 years ago, it was very big on divestments, right? And that's the whole solution, what you should do. And what we see now is that the market transfers more towards engagement, which might be also driven a little bit by the SRD too, who also focus very much on engagement. And the Alliance has engagement as an ambition, and engagement with the underlying companies in an investment portfolio. And I also like that very much, so in that way I think it's really a great alliance, sorry. But they say in the end, for you as an investment manager, it might be very easy to have by today a net greenhouse gas emission portfolio, net zero greenhouse gas emission portfolio. Just divest everything and then it's done. But the question is, has then the real world really changed? No. So, and the aspiration is for everybody of us, I guess, not that we as a company say, yeah, we are great because we do not have any emissions in our portfolio anymore. The goal is also to help the world to move to the next level, because climate change will impact us all. And in that way, the goal is to engage with the companies in the portfolio, and as these companies transition, our portfolio automatically also transitions, which I very much like. I think it's a very smart idea, and it goes really to the nerve of how we can change the world. And that's the reason why I like it, and that's the goal, what we want to do. And we are still at a very early point in the Alliance and currently develop a little bit how do we want to, because we need to set targets and we need to report on a regular basis. So we put pressure on ourselves, which I think is also great. And before we can do that, we need to think about what is the right approach to measure us for target setting and afterwards for progress reporting. And that goes back to my very early statement when I was about, we struggle a little bit with methodologies and approaches and tools we currently have to make sure that we are 2 degree aligned or 1.5 degree aligned, right, to measure how much is our portfolio in that way aligned. So that's the working we are currently doing.
So clear impact in focus with this asset owner net zero carbon alliance. So I think that was also a wish to PRI that they move on in the path of making it more standardized, aligning the different interests of different investors. I think we come to an end with this panel unless there is another urgent question from the audience. That doesn't seem to be the case. Then please join me in thanking the panelists for their contributions. Thanks a lot for the insights. At this point, I would also like to thank the PRI from the side of SSF for bringing their know-how to Zurich and making this event possible. I again would like to thank our host, Zürcher Kantonalbank, for hosting us so generally at this very prime location so centrally, which made us limit the audience a bit, but it was great to be here. Thanks a lot. And I now hand over to the host, to René, for some last closing remarks. Just one more organizational point of view. Once he finishes, we will set up lunch in this room. So the ones at the back, please move to the front. We will push the chairs to the front and lunch will be served back there. Please help us with this logistically. Thanks for having been here. It was a pleasure talking to you, to have had you all in the room. And now I hand over to René.
Thanks a lot. Well, I don't want to keep you too long from the lunch, but let me close with a personal note. Roughly 15, 16 years ago, I had a few drinks and a few lunches just around the corner with a funny guy, which happened to do a PhD on the same topic as I did, engagement and proxy voting within pension funds. And this guy was working with UNEP-FI, was from Australia, and basically was James Gifford, and was the one who then became the CEO of the UN PRI and actually launched the PRI together with UNEP-FI. So I'm very happy that we had the chance to host this event. I think the PRI has moved a lot over the last 15, 16 years with the help of many peoples, obviously, and with 2,600 signatories, 90 trillions, you also have a big power and a big responsibility. We, as signatories, also have the same responsibility, And I think that we have profited this morning from a lot of insights, and I'm really happy that we had the chance to talk together this morning. Thank you very much.